The rusted sign above the exotic beast market read, "No refunds on sentience." Arthur knew it was a scam. The whole station was a scam. But then he saw her. A matted, trembling ball of fur and copper wire shoved into a dirty acrylic clearance bin. Not quite a normal cat, not quite a machine. Then, a voice scraped against the inside of his skull, brittle as oxidized metal. "Nobody wants me." Arthur was a mechanic. He fixed broken things. He didn't know he was about to fix the galaxy. The air on Promenade Deck 4 tasted like burnt ozone and synthetic garlic. Arthur Finch hated it. He hated the noise. He hated the damp heat venting from the overhead atmospheric scrubbers. And most of all, he hated the livestock market. He didn't come down here out of any bleeding heart desire to save the galaxy's fauna. He needed a very specific gauge of tungsten wiring that only the illegal poacher ships bothered to smuggle in as packing material. Arthur wiped a smear of hydro grease from his forehead with the back of a calloused hand, leaving a dark streak across his brow. His knee ached. A dull, rhythmic throb that matched the heavy, synthesized bass pumping out of a nearby cantina. 30 years turning wrenches on long-haul freighters had left him with a spine like a rusted coil and a temperament to match. He limped past stalls overflowing with screeching avian creatures from the core worlds, ignoring the merchants waving colorful, scaled reptiles in his face. His heavy steel-toed boots clumped against the grated decking. Then he stopped. It wasn't a sound that made him halt. It was a pressure, a sudden, sharp ache right behind his eyes, like the sudden shift in cabin gravity when a ship drops out of warp. Arthur grunted, pressing 2 oily fingers to the bridge of his nose. He squeezed his eyes shut. A hangover, he told himself. Too much of that cheap synthetic bourbon last night. "Nobody wants me." The words didn't come through his ears. They manifested directly against his frontal lobe, raw and stinging. The voice lacked gender or age. It just felt tired, exhausted, defeated. Arthur snapped his eyes open. He looked left, then right. The crowds of dock workers, tourists, and smugglers pushed past him, oblivious. He turned his gaze toward the source of the pressure. It was a small, grimy stall squeezed between a noodle stand and a cybernetics chop shop. A human merchant, a sweaty, overweight man wearing a stained yellow jumpsuit, sat on a crate smoking a thin cigar. Behind him, stacked haphazardly, were small cages. Most were empty. One, shoved onto the bottom shelf in the shadow of a leaking coolant pipe, was not. Arthur walked over. The pressure in his head intensified with every step, vibrating against his teeth. He squatted down, his bad knee popping loud enough to make the merchant look up. Inside the cage sat a creature. It looked vaguely feline, roughly the size of a standard Earth house cat, but its proportions were entirely wrong. Its ears were too large, tufted and swiveling with frantic, jerky motions. The fur was a mottled, filthy gray, heavily matted with dried blood and what looked like engine sludge. But the most jarring detail was the crude cybernetic port violently grafted into the base of its neck. The skin around the metal was inflamed, oozing a clear, yellowish fluid. Its eyes were huge, solid pools of reflective gold, staring blankly at the bottom of the cage. "Cold," the voice whispered in his head. "Too cold. Won't sell. Going to the incinerator." Arthur swallowed hard. The taste of bile and old coffee coated his tongue. He hated telepaths. They were illegal on most frontier stations for a reason. They dug into your head, pulled up your worst memories and sold them back to you. But this wasn't digging. This was just bleeding. The creature was projecting its misery into the ether like a cracked radiator venting steam. "Hey!" Arthur barked, his voice rough as sandpaper. He didn't look at the merchant, keeping his eyes on the cage. "What is this?" The merchant, a guy whose name tag read Fletcher, leaned over and spat a glob of brown saliva onto the deck. "Trash. Got it off a scavenger crew out near the belt. Some kind of deep space hybrid. Supposed to be a companion animal for high-orbit elites. Empathic resonance, they said. Syncs to your mood." Fletcher laughed, a wet, hacking sound. "Thing's defective. Screams in your head if you get too close. Scares the customers. I'm tossing it in the biomass recycler at shift change." Arthur watched the creature. It hadn't moved. It was shivering violently, the raw skin around its neck port twitching. He shouldn't do it. Arthur knew he shouldn't do it. He lived in a cramped two-room repair bay. He ate dehydrated ration packs. He was cynical, tired, and entirely unqualified to care for a living, breathing thing. He was a mechanic. He dealt with things that had manuals, things that could be turned off. "Hurts," the voice whimpered. It wasn't a plea for help. It was just a statement of fact, the absolute resignation of a creature that had accepted its fate as garbage. Arthur's jaw tightened. He reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a battered cred stick. He stood up, towering over the seated merchant, casting a long shadow over the stall. "I'll give you 50 credits, Arthur said. Fletcher scoffed, taking a drag of his cigar. "The cage is worth 60. I told you the thing is defective. You don't want it, pal. It'll just keep you up at night crying in your brain." "I said," Arthur leaned in, letting his natural, grease-stained menace do the talking. The smell of plasma burns and stale sweat rolled off him. 50 credits for the creature. You keep the cage. I'll carry it." Fletcher paused. He looked at Arthur's hands, massive, scarred, with knuckles like crushed walnuts. The merchant shrugged, snatched the cred stick, and swiped it on his terminal. "Your funeral, grease monkey." Fletcher unlatched the cage. Arthur reached in. He didn't hesitate. His large hands, rough and calloused, wrapped gently around the shivering, filthy mass of fur and metal. The creature flinched, a sharp spike of pure terror lancing through Arthur's skull, blinding him for a second. He gritted his teeth, holding steady. He pulled her out. She weighed nothing, just sharp bones and matted hair. He tucked her inside his heavy canvas jacket, pressing her against the warm, flannel-lined interior, right over his chest. "Warm?" The voice in his head flickered, confused. "Yeah," Arthur muttered out loud, turning his back on Fletcher and walking away. "Let's go home, kid." The walk back to Repair Bay 42 felt twice as long as usual. The creature inside Arthur's jacket didn't move, but he could feel the rapid, frantic fluttering of its heart against his ribs. It felt like holding a dying bird. The telepathic whispers had faded into a dull, static hum, a subconscious broadcast of exhaustion and lingering pain. Arthur punched the keypad outside his bay. The heavy blast doors groaned, protesting loudly before sliding apart to reveal his sanctuary. The air inside was thick, but it was a familiar, comforting thick. The sharp tang of ionized welding gas, the deep, earthy scent of refined lubricating oil, and the faint, sweet smell of roasted coffee beans. The bay was a chaotic mess of half-disassembled engine cowlings, gutted power distributors, and scattered diagnostic tools. Dim, flickering halogen lights cast long, jagged shadows across the grease-stained concrete floor. Arthur kicked the door controls to seal the bay, shutting out the relentless noise of the station. Silence, save for the low hum of the environmental scrubbers, filled the room. He walked over to his primary workbench. He shoved a pile of stripped copper wiring and a broken plasma torch onto the floor with his elbow, clearing a space. Slowly, carefully, he unzipped his jacket. He lifted the creature out and set her on the cool metal of the workbench. She collapsed immediately, her thin legs folding underneath her. In the harsh light of the work desk, she looked even worse than in the market. Her fur, which Arthur could now see was a pale, dusty silver beneath the grime, was falling out in patches. The cybernetic port on the back of her neck was crudely installed. A butcher's job. The titanium casing was scarred, and the surrounding tissue was deeply infected. It was a neural link node, the kind usually reserved for heavy machinery operators, scaled down and jammed into a tiny spine. Jesus, Arthur breathed, pulling a small penlight from his breast pocket. He clicked it on and shined it over the port. The creature flinched away from the light, letting out a physical sound this time. A dry, raspy hiss that ended in a wet cough. Don't fix, cannot fix, broken, the voice echoed in his mind. It was defensive now, laced with a cynical edge that mirrored Arthur's own internal monologue. Waste of time. Shut up, Arthur said aloud, his voice gruff but lacking any real heat. I decide what's a waste of my time in this shop. He didn't know the first thing about alien biology, but he knew mechanics. He knew hardware, and he knew that a corrupted interface could fry a motherboard. This port was poisoning her, leaking heavy metals and localized electric shocks directly into her nervous system. Arthur turned away and rummaged through a rusted medical kit hanging on the wall. He grabbed a bottle of high-grade surgical alcohol, some sterile swabs, a tube of synthetic skin graft gel, and a pair of fine-tipped electrical tweezers. He dragged a stool over to the workbench and sat down. He poured some of the alcohol onto a swab. The sharp chemical smell filled the space between them. This is gonna sting, Arthur muttered. Don't bite me. I bite back. He reached out. The creature flattened her ears, her golden eyes locking onto his. Fear, pain, stop. I know, Arthur said, surprisingly soft. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it was okay, because it clearly wasn't. But the rust has to come off before the engine can run. He pressed the swab gently against the weeping edge of the neck port. The creature arched her spine, a silent scream exploding in Arthur's head. It was a localized supernova of agony. Arthur gripped the edge of the workbench with his free hand until his knuckles turned white, forcing himself not to pull away. He rode out the telepathic shockwave, keeping his breathing steady, anchoring her. Hurts! Hurts! Hold still, he grunted, using the tweezers to pick away tiny flakes of rusted metal and dried blood that were packed into the interface seam. Almost got it. Whoever installed this was a butcher, used industrial flux instead of biosealant. He worked with the steady, practiced precision of a master mechanic. His hands, usually clumsy and heavy outside of work, moved with delicate millimeter accuracy. He cleaned the infection, flushed the port with alcohol, and carefully applied a thick layer of the cooling, synthetic skin gel around the inflamed flesh. As the gel numbed the area, the screaming in Arthur's head began to dial down. It dropped from a shriek to a whimper, and finally to a dull, rhythmic throb. The creature slumped onto her side, panting. Her golden eyes fluttered. Arthur wiped his brow, realizing he was sweating profusely. He tossed the bloody swabs into a waste bin and capped the alcohol. He looked down at the tiny, ruined thing on his workbench. He had spent his last 50 credits on a dying alien pet. He was going to have to eat synthesized gruel for the next 2 weeks. Why? The voice was barely a whisper now, slipping into the dark edges of sleep. I am defective, not optimal. Waste. Arthur reached out and gently ran a grease-stained thumb over the uninjured side of her head, right behind her tufted ear. The fur was coarse, but underneath the dirt, it was startlingly soft. Optimal is a corporate word, kid, Arthur murmured, leaning back in his stool and listening to the faint, steady hum of his station. Out here in the real world, everything's a little defective. We just figure out how to keep running anyway. The creature didn't respond. She had passed out, her small chest rising and falling in an even, unlabored rhythm for the first time. Arthur watched her for a long time. He didn't know what species she was. He didn't know what she ate. But as he grabbed an oily rag and began wiping down his tools, he realized the chronic aching pressure behind his eyes. The headache he had carried for years from the sheer, crushing loneliness of deep space was gone. I think I'll call you Pip, Arthur said to the empty room. For the first time in a decade, the mechanic wasn't alone. The artificial morning cycle on Promenade Deck 4 announced itself with a harsh, flickering shift in the overhead strip lighting, shifting from a bruised purple to a sickly, jaundiced yellow. Arthur woke up in his worn leather recliner, his neck cricked at a brutal angle. He groaned, the sound vibrating deep in his chest, and dragged a heavy hand down his face. His mouth tasted like stale copper and old regrets. He blinked away the grit in his eyes and looked toward the workbench. Pip was awake. She was sitting perfectly still, her thin tail wrapped tightly around her skeletal legs. Her oversized golden eyes were locked onto him, unblinking in the dim light of the repair bay. The synthetic skin gel had hardened into a pale, rubbery crust over her neck port, sealing the infection. She looked less like garbage this morning and more like a refugee. Loud, the voice whispered in his head. It was clearer today, less static, more defined. It felt like a dry leaf brushing against his temporal lobe. Your mind is very loud, gears turning, grinding, metal on metal. Arthur grunted and pushed himself out of the chair. His bad knee protested with a sharp pop. That's just called waking up, kid. Get used to it. He limped over to a stained, humming unit in the corner that served as both a chemical refrigerator and a ration dispenser. He yanked the handle. The hinge shrieked. Inside sat 3 silver foil packets of nutrient paste and a half-empty bottle of synthesized water. He grabbed a packet, tossed it onto the counter, and tore the top off with his teeth. He squeezed a dollop of thick, brown sludge onto a clean scrap of aluminum plating and carried it over to the workbench. He set it down in front of Pip. She leaned forward, her tufted ears twitching. She sniffed the paste. A distinct wave of revulsion rippled through Arthur's mind, tasting vaguely of wet ash and bitter alkaloids. Not food, she stated. Lubricant, dead matter. It's protein, Arthur said, taking the remaining foil packet and squeezing a mouthful of the paste directly into his own mouth. He chewed grimly, his jaw muscles jumping. It tasted like salted cardboard. "It keeps the engine running. Eat it." Pip looked from the aluminum plate to Arthur. She didn't move. Arthur sighed, a heavy, tired sound that stirred the dust motes dancing in the yellow light. "Look, I don't have premium bio kibble. I barely have credits for keeping the lights on. You want to starve? That's your call. But I didn't spend my last 50 creds to watch you die of stubbornness." He turned his back on her, walking over to his coffee percolator. It was a terrifying contraption he had cobbled together from a busted warp coil cooler and copper tubing. He slammed a battered mug under the spout and hit the purge valve. Black, viscous liquid sputtered out, smelling aggressively of roasted chicory and burnt plastic. Behind him, he heard a wet, tentative smacking sound. A small spike of reluctant satisfaction bloomed in the back of his mind. "Salty, terrible, necessary. That's the spirit," Arthur muttered, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. It burned the roof of his mouth, just the way he needed it to. He walked back to the bench. Pip was systematically cleaning the aluminum plate, her rough, pale tongue working efficiently. As she ate, Arthur took a closer look at the cybernetic port on the back of her neck. Now that the blood and grease were cleared away, he could see the tiny laser-etched serial numbers along the titanium housing. It wasn't a commercial empathy link. It was military grade. Arthur's stomach tightened, the cheap protein paste turning to lead. He leaned in, squinting at the micro engravings. Mil-spec data siphon, Class 4. She wasn't a companion animal. She was a living, breathing thumb drive. A courier meant to smuggle encrypted data past orbital security scanners. Telepaths were highly prized in corporate espionage because their brainwaves could act as an organic firewall, shielding stored data from digital probes. The port wasn't just shocking her. It was trying to write data to her biological memory centers. "Who did this to you?" Arthur asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Pip froze. Her ears flattened flush against her skull. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A sudden, violent cascade of images smashed into Arthur's mind. Cold steel tables, white blinding lights, the smell of ozone and burnt hair. A man with a synthetic jaw and dead gray eyes holding a pneumatic staple gun. The crushing weight of terabytes of data being forced into a brain too small to hold it. The screaming. The endless silent screaming. Arthur gasped, staggering backward. He dropped his coffee mug. It shattered on the concrete floor, splashing black liquid across his boots. He gripped the edge of the workbench, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The psychic link snapped shut, leaving a ringing echo in Arthur's ears. Pip was backed into the corner of the workbench, pressing herself against the brick wall. She was trembling violently, her golden eyes wide with panic. "Sorry," her voice was tiny, fragmented, shivering in the dark corners of his mind. "Spilled. Did not mean to spill. Do not hit." Arthur slowly straightened up. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the shattered mug, then up at the terrified creature. He didn't feel pity. He felt a sudden, cold fury settling deep in his gut, dense and heavy as a Durasteel block. "I'm not going to hit you," Arthur said, his voice completely flat. He reached for a shop rag and tossed it over the spilled coffee. "But if that guy with the metal jaw comes looking for you, I'm going to need a bigger wrench." Arthur spent the next 4 hours avoiding the reality of his situation by doing what he did best, turning wrenches. He had a contract to rebuild a pair of atmospheric thrusters for a local cargo hauler. The work was loud, greasy, and mindless. Exactly what he needed. The heavy thrum of the pneumatic impact driver vibrated up his arm, settling into his shoulder joint with a familiar, aching rhythm. Sparks cascaded over the scarred toes of his boots as he ground down a welded seam. The air in the bay grew thick with the smell of vaporized steel and sweat. Pip watched him the entire time. She had moved from the workbench to the top of a stacked crate of hydraulic fluid, finding a warm spot directly under one of the halogen lamps. She didn't broadcast into his mind while he worked. She just observed, her large golden eyes tracking his movements with eerie precision. Whenever Arthur slipped into a moment of frustration, a stripped bolt, a seized bearing, he felt a subtle, cooling pressure at the base of his skull. It wasn't words. It was just a sensation, like a damp cloth pressed to a feverish forehead, smoothing out the spike of anger before it could fully form. It was unsettling and incredibly useful. He was just wiping the hydro grease off his hands with a chemical solvent when the heavy blast doors of his bay chimed. Arthur froze. He didn't get walk-ins. His clients contacted him through the station's encrypted comms network. He looked up at Pip. Her ears were swiveled forward, locked onto the door. "Danger," she whispered. It was a sharp, jagged spike of alarm. "Cold metal, bad intent." Arthur tossed the rag onto the thruster casing. He reached under his workbench, his hand closing around the heavy, rubberized grip of a foot-long plasma torch. He didn't turn it on, just kept it hidden behind his thigh. He keyed the door release. The blast doors ground open, revealing two men standing in the corridor. The one in front was tall, built like a brick wall, wearing a cheap synth leather jacket. His head was shaved bald, and a thick network of faded corporate prison tattoos snaked up his neck. But it was the man behind him that made Arthur's blood run cold. He was leaner, dressed in an immaculate dark gray tailored suit that looked obscenely out of place on the grime-coated promenade. The lower half of his face was a seamless prosthetic of brushed chrome. His eyes were dead, flat gray discs, the man from Pip's memories. "Arthur Finch?" the man with the chrome jaw asked. His voice was synthesized, completely devoid of inflection. It sounded like a navigation computer announcing a course correction. "Depends who's asking," Arthur replied, shifting his weight slightly, planting his boots firmly on the slick concrete. The large man in the leather jacket stepped forward, crowding the doorway. He smelled strongly of cheap alcohol and stale sweat. "We're looking for a piece of stolen property, Finch, missing hardware. A vendor upstairs said you bought a defective biologic this morning." "I buy a lot of junk," Arthur said, his face impassive. "You're gonna have to be more specific." The man with the chrome jaw didn't blink. He stepped past his muscle, walking into the repair bay. His eyes swept the room, taking in the disassembled engines, the tools, the oil stains. Then they locked onto the stack of crates in the corner. Arthur saw the gray eyes narrow. Pip was frozen, pressed flat against the top crate, blending into the shadows. "The biologic is not junk," the chrome-jawed man said, his artificial voice clicking softly. "It is a Class 4 data siphon carrying proprietary corporate algorithms. You are going to hand it over, Mr. Finch. If you do, we will compensate you for your 50 credits. If you do not, my associate will break your legs, and we will take it anyway." Arthur didn't look at Pip. He kept his eyes dead center on the suit. "Hide," Arthur thought, projecting the word as hard as he could toward the corner of the room. "Get behind the plasma tanks." He felt a tiny, terrified flicker of acknowledgement, followed by the faint scrape of claws on metal as Pip slipped down behind the crates. "That's a generous offer," Arthur said, his grip tightening on the heavy torch behind his leg. But the thing died an hour ago. Seizure. The neck port was leaking battery acid into its spine. Toss the carcass down the bio-waste chute on level 3. The large man in the jacket snorted. "He's lying, Mercer. I can smell the damn thing." Mercer, the suit, tilted his head slightly. "Search the bay. Kill the mechanic." The large man lunged. Arthur was old, and his knee was shot. But he had spent 30 years surviving bar fights in deep space mining colonies. He didn't try to block. As the massive thug swung a heavy, brass-knuckled fist at his head, Arthur ducked, letting the blow sail past his ear and brought the heavy plasma torch up in a brutal, underhanded arc. The solid metal base of the torch slammed directly into the thug's kneecap with a sickening crunch. The man roared, his leg buckling instantly. But his forward momentum carried him, crashing his heavy shoulder into Arthur's chest. Arthur went down hard, the breath blasting out of his lungs as the back of his head slammed against the concrete floor. The world went white, then dissolved into a spray of static. He tasted blood. The thug was on top of him, pinning Arthur's arms with his massive knees, raising a heavy fist to finish the job. Arthur couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. Suddenly, the thug froze. The man's eyes went wide, pupils blowing out to the edges of his irises. A terrible, wet, gurgling sound escaped his throat. He dropped his fists and clutched both hands to his own head, screaming, a high, reedy sound of absolute, mind-shattering agony. Arthur rolled out from under the thrashing man, coughing violently. He scrambled back, looking toward the crates. Pip was standing on the edge of the hydraulic tank, her fur standing completely on end, turning her into a ragged puffball of static electricity. Her golden eyes were glowing, literally radiating a faint, bioluminescent light. The air around her smelled sharply of ozone and burning copper. She wasn't just projecting emotion, she was weaponizing it. Mercer stepped forward, his chrome jaw clicking open. He pulled a sleek, suppressed kinetic pistol from his jacket, aiming it directly at the tiny creature. "No!" Arthur roared. He didn't think. He reached over, grabbed the heavy pneumatic impact driver from the workbench, and hurled it with everything he had. The heavy tool spun through the air, 20 pounds of solid steel and battery casing, and slammed squarely into Mercer's chest. The suit was thrown backward, the pistol discharging into the ceiling, before he crashed out through the open blast doors and collapsed in the corridor. Arthur scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, blood running down his chin. He hit the manual override on the door console. The heavy blast doors slammed shut and locked with a resounding boom, sealing them inside. Silence descended on the bay, save for the whimpering of the thug, curled into a fetal position on the floor, his mind effectively short-circuited. Arthur leaned against the door, sliding down until he hit the floor. He wiped a smear of blood from his mouth. Pip hopped down from the crates. She walked over to him, her gait wobbly and exhausted. She curled up directly on his steel-toed boot, resting her chin on his shin. The glow had faded from her eyes. "Loud," she whispered in his mind, the voice trembling. "Too loud." "Yeah," Arthur breathed, looking at the locked door, knowing the corporate hounds would be back with heavier firepower. "We're gonna have to find a quieter neighborhood, kid." The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a cold, nauseating void in Arthur's stomach. His hands, previously steady enough to calibrate microvalves, were shaking violently. He stared at the thug writhing on the concrete, the man's heavy boots scraping weakly against the floor. Arthur forced himself to move. He limped over to a pegboard, his knee screaming with every step, and yanked down a coil of industrial high-tensile polymer zip ties. He knelt beside the groaning man, the smell of the thug's sweat mingling with the sharp coppery tang of the blood leaking from Arthur's own split lip. With jerky, ungraceful movements, Arthur hauled the massive arms behind the man's back. The plastic teeth of the ties made a harsh, ratcheting zip-zip-zip sound as he pulled them flush against the wrists, cutting off the circulation just enough to ensure the guy wasn't going anywhere. He pushed himself up, leaning heavily against his workbench, and surveyed his repair bay. 30 years. He had spent 3 decades breathing this recycled air, scrubbing this specific synthetic oil out of his fingernails, and building a fortress of scrap metal to keep the universe out. It was a miserable, cramped, greasy hole. It was his home, and it was gone. Mercer wouldn't stop. Corporations didn't write off stolen, highly classified hardware just because an old mechanic asked nicely. They would send a hit squad, they would tear the bay apart, and they would feed Arthur to the station's bio-recyclers. He dragged a heavy canvas duffel bag from beneath his cot. He didn't pack clothes. Clothes could be bought. He packed survival. He shoved in a hydro spanner, a set of precision calipers, an omni meter, and a heavy, oily slug thrower pistol wrapped in a rag, a weapon he hated, a relic from a mining war he tried hard to forget. From a false bottom in his toolbox, he extracted a handful of physical platinum cred chips and a forged transit pass he had kept for a rainy day. It was pouring. He looked over at Pip. The creature was still curled in a tight ball on the toe of his boot. Her breathing was shallow. Using her empathic abilities as a weapon had drained her completely. She looked fragile, a bundle of sharp angles and singed fur. Lost, the whisper in his mind was so faint it felt like a ghost brushing against his thoughts. My fault. Lost nest. Lost safe. Arthur paused, his hand gripping the brass zipper of the duffel bag. A surge of bitter resentment flared in his chest, a sudden, sharp anger at this broken thing for dragging him into its nightmare. If he left her here, he could walk away. He could blend into the station crowds. He could survive. He felt Pip flinch against his boot. She had felt the resentment. She didn't broadcast a defense. She just broadcast acceptance. The cold, familiar acceptance of the incinerator. Arthur cursed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the cynical instinct that had kept him alive for 50 years. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the spike of pain, and carefully scooped her up. She weighed nothing. The nest was a dump anyway, Arthur muttered, his voice gravelly. He unzipped his heavy jacket and tucked her securely against his chest, right over his pounding heart. We'll find a better one. He walked to the back of the bay. Behind a stack of rusted environmental scrubbers lay a heavy steel grate set into the floor. It led down to the station's gray water drainage mains, a maze of dripping pipes and chemical runoff that the security drones actively avoided. He hooked his fingers into the grate, groaning as he strained upward. The metal shrieked in protest, 30 years of rust fighting his grip. It gave way with a sudden, violent crack, slamming against the concrete. The smell hit him instantly. A thick, suffocating stench of ammonia, stagnant water, and rotting biological matter. Arthur tied a grease-stained bandana over his mouth and nose. He slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, grabbed a heavy mag flashlight from the wall, and swung his legs into the dark, narrow shaft. He didn't look back at his shop. He couldn't afford to. He climbed down the rusted rungs, the damp chill of the subterranean tunnels seeping through his boots immediately. When his feet hit the slick, sludge-covered grated floor of the main tunnel, he flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut a narrow, dust-choked path through the absolute blackness. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, echoing like a sluggish heartbeat. "Dark," Pip murmured against his ribs. She shivered, pressing closer to his body heat. "Keep your eyes open, kid," Arthur said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "If you feel anything with a pulse up ahead, you let me know." He began to walk, his heavy boots squelching in the toxic runoff, leaving his life behind in the dark. The gray water mains were a sensory nightmare. The air was thick, clinging to Arthur's skin like an oily film. His flashlight beam illuminated slick, algae-covered pipes and patches of bioluminescent mold that pulsed with a sickly green light. The rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of the station's primary gravity generators vibrated up through the soles of his boots, rattling his teeth. They walked for an hour, or maybe it was 3. Time lost its shape in the subterranean bowels of Promenade 4. Arthur's lungs burned from the chemical fumes. His bad knee had locked up 20 minutes ago, forcing him to drag his right leg with a heavy, uneven limp. The duffel bag dug a deep groove into his shoulder. Suddenly, a sharp, icy spike lanced through the center of his forehead. "Stop," Pip warned. The word wasn't a whisper. It was an urgent vibration against his skull. Hate, sharp hate, above us, moving fast. Arthur froze, killing the flashlight instantly. He pressed his back against the curved, freezing wall of a drainage pipe. Above them, through the thick grated ceiling, he heard it. The heavy synchronized thud of mag boots striking the primary decking. They were marching in perfect unison. Corporate security, Mercer's people. Looking, Pip projected, her terror translating into a sour, metallic taste in the back of Arthur's mouth. Searching the dark, Arthur held his breath until his lungs screamed for oxygen. The footsteps passed overhead, fading down the corridor. He waited another full minute before clicking the flashlight back on, angling it downward to minimize the glare. "Good job," he rasped, coughing to clear the ammonia from his throat. He gently patted the lump in his jacket. "We're almost there." His destination was Sub-Hangar 12. It was an off-the-books docking bay used by smugglers and scavengers who couldn't afford the station's official tariffs. A month ago, Arthur had done a complete overhaul on the plasma manifolds of a beat-up light freighter belonging to a spice runner named Jax. Jax hadn't paid him. The ship was still sitting in the hangar, acting as collateral. Arthur rounded a final bend in the tunnel and faced a heavy blast door heavily crusted with lime scale. He punched the override code into the rusted keypad. The door hissed, protesting loudly, and slid open. The hangar was cavernous, drafty, and smelled of stale rocket fuel and cold iron. Sitting in the center of the bay was the Iron Hound. She was an ugly, wedge-shaped vessel, covered in scorch marks and patched hull plating. She looked like a brick with thrusters attached to it. To Arthur, she looked beautiful. He hobbled across the open decking, keeping his head on a swivel. The station's automated docking clamps were engaged, locking the ship to the deck. He reached the entry ramp and popped the access panel, hot wiring the hydraulics to drop the boarding ramp. The interior of the Ironhound was pitch black and freezing. The life support had been running on a skeleton battery for weeks. Arthur stumbled into the cramped cockpit, dropping his duffel bag onto the cracked synth leather of the pilot's chair. He slid into the seat, his hands flying over the dormant console. He flicked switches and twisted dials in a desperate, frantic rhythm. Nothing happened. The console remained dark. The main reactor was completely dead. The cold start sequence wasn't catching. "Come on, you piece of junk," Arthur growled, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Panic, thick and suffocating, began to claw at his chest. If he couldn't get the reactor online, they were trapped in a metal coffin. He grabbed his hydrospanner, intending to rip open the primary console to manually short the ignition relay. Calm. The sensation hit him like a wave of cool water washing over a severe burn. The frantic hammering rhythm of his heart slowed. The blinding edge of his panic dulled, leaving behind cold, sharp clarity. Pip poked her head out of his jacket collar. Her golden eyes were fixed on the console, glowing with a faint, steady light. She wasn't overriding his fear. She was absorbing it, taking the toxic edge off his adrenaline so he could think. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath. He dropped the spanner. "Auxiliary bypass," he muttered, realizing his mistake. Jax had rerouted the ignition sequence to avoid Port Authority scans. He reached under the main console, feeling blindly through a nest of exposed wiring until his fingers brushed a toggle switch hidden behind a ventilation grate. He flipped it, then slammed his palm onto the main ignition primer. Deep within the belly of the Ironhound, a low guttural whine began to build. The deck plates vibrated. The cockpit screens flickered to life, bathing the cramped space in a harsh amber glow. Suddenly, the hangar proximity alarm screamed. Arthur looked at the external monitors. The main hangar doors were grinding open. 4 men in tactical armor, led by the chrome-jawed Mercer, spilled into the bay, their assault rifles raised. "Hold on to something," Arthur yelled, throwing the throttle forward before the engines were fully warmed up. The Ironhound screamed in protest. Arthur punched the docking release. The clamps exploded in a shower of sparks, sheared violently off their moorings by the sudden thrust. The heavy freighter lurched upward, throwing Arthur hard against his restraints. Kinetic rounds pinged harmlessly against the reinforced hull as the ship blasted out of the sub-hangar, punching through the station's atmospheric containment field and plunging into the vast, silent, and endless dark of open space. The Ironhound violently shuddered, its structural integrity groaning as Arthur pushed the sublight thrusters past their red line. The console screamed warnings in a strobe of yellow and red, flashing frantic errors about hull stress and thermal overload. He didn't care. He needed distance. Space was a vacuum, but the area around the station was thick with automated defense turrets and patrol cutters. "Come on, you ugly brick," Arthur hissed through gritted teeth, his hands white-knuckled on the yoke. He punched a randomized string of coordinates into the nav computer, not even looking at the destination, and slammed his palm against the heavy slip-jump engagement lever. For 3 terrifying seconds, the ship simply vibrated, the warp drive spooling with a high-pitched whine that rattled the fillings in Arthur's teeth. Then, the stars outside the reinforced viewport stretched into long, blinding streaks of white light. A heavy, invisible hand slammed into Arthur's chest, pinning him to the cracked synth leather seat as the freighter punched a hole into slip space. The sudden transition from chaotic flight to the smooth, eerie stillness of the warp tunnel was jarring. The deafening roar of the thrusters cut out, replaced by the low, continuous hum of the quantum drive. Arthur sat perfectly still for a long moment. He stared at the hypnotic, swirling blue vortex outside the glass. His chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow gasps. Then, the adrenaline crash hit him. It felt like walking off a cliff in the dark. His stomach plummeted, and a violent wave of nausea washed over him. His busted knee screamed, a localized fire radiating up his thigh. His ribs, where the corporate thug had slammed into him, throbbed with a dull, heavy ache that made breathing a conscious effort. He tasted copper and old grease. He unbuckled his harness with trembling fingers and slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold metal edge of the console. A faint scratching sound reached his ears. Arthur cracked an eye open. Pip had clawed her way out of his heavy canvas jacket and was standing on the co-pilot's console. The ambient temperature in the cockpit was freezing. The Ironhound's life support was notoriously terrible, and the creature was shivering, her thin, skeletal frame trembling violently. But she wasn't looking at the alien blue light of the warp tunnel. She was looking at him, broken. Her voice brushed against his mind. It was exhausted, stripped of the static it held earlier, leaving behind a raw, naked sadness. "You are leaking. Heartbeats too fast. Pain." Arthur groaned, pushing himself upright and wiping a smear of half-dried blood from his chin. "I'm fine, kid. Just getting old. Parts wear out. Doesn't mean the machine stops running." He reached over, grabbed his discarded jacket, and clumsily draped it over her small body, creating a heavy canvas tent to trap the meager heat. Pip burrowed into it immediately, leaving only her large golden eyes exposed. Arthur forced himself to stand, gripping the back of the pilot's chair for balance. The deck plates vibrated gently beneath his boots. He limped out of the cockpit and down the narrow, dimly lit corridor that served as the ship's primary artery. The air smelled of burnt ozone, chemical coolants, and a faint, lingering odor of the previous owner's cheap cigars. He found the medical locker in the crew galley. It was mostly empty, but he managed to scrounge a tube of synthetic dermal sealant and a couple of heavy-duty painkillers. He swallowed the pills dry, wincing as they scratched down his throat, and smeared the sealant over the split in his lip. It stung fiercely, a sharp chemical burn that made his eyes water. He leaned against the bulkhead, staring at the grime-coated deck. He had nothing, no shop, no credits, no tools except the few he threw in a bag. He was a fugitive in a stolen ship with a dying engine, running from a corporate hit squad. My fault. The thought wasn't his. It drifted from the cockpit, heavy and suffocating. Arthur pushed himself off the wall and limped back to the front of the ship. Pip hadn't moved from beneath the jacket. "Don't do that," Arthur said, his voice rough. He dropped heavily back into the pilot's chair. "Don't take inventory of my head without asking." "Hunt," Pip projected, ignoring his reprimand. A series of fragmented images flickered in his mind. Mercer's chrome jaw, the cold steel tables, the staple gun. "Because of me. They will not stop. I am a beacon. Better to throw me out. Airlock. You live." Arthur stared at her. The pure, logical resignation in her projection made his chest tighten. She genuinely believed she was disposable hardware. "You listen to me," Arthur said, leaning closer, locking his exhausted eyes onto her glowing golden ones. "Those suits didn't come after me just because of you. They came because they think people like me, and things like you, are just numbers on a spreadsheet. Trash to be stepped on. He reached out, his thick, grease-stained finger gently stroking the patch of soft fur between her oversized ears. She flinched initially, then leaned into the touch, a faint rattling purr starting deep in her chest. "I don't throw away salvageable parts," Arthur murmured, turning his attention to the ship's diagnostic screens. "And I don't let suits dictate my retirement plans. Now, let's figure out how they were tracking you." The engineering bay of the Ironhound was a cramped, claustrophobic wedge at the rear of the ship. The noise of the warp core was deafening here, a relentless rhythmic thrum that vibrated directly into the marrow of Arthur's bones. The air was stiflingly hot, smelling of cooked copper and atomized hydro fluid. Arthur had cleared a space on a metal workbench, sweeping aside a pile of stripped relays and empty ration tins. He laid down a clean microfiber cloth and gently set Pip in the center of it. He had rigged a heavy work lamp overhead, bathing the creature in a harsh, unforgiving white light. Pip flattened her ears against the glare, her tail wrapping tightly around her paws. But she didn't try to flee. "All right," Arthur muttered, adjusting a pair of heavy magnifying goggles over his eyes. "Let's see what's under the hood." He leaned in, examining the titanium port grafted into the base of her neck. The synthetic skin gel he had applied earlier had done its job, sealing the raw infection, but the hardware itself was still a catastrophic mess. He picked up a microscanner from his duffel bag and ran it over the port. The scanner chirped, a rapid, frantic sound. Arthur swore under his breath. "Active subspace ping, encrypted. It's broadcasting a localized handshake every 3 minutes. The second we drop out of this warp tunnel, Mercer's boys are going to get a location lock." "Cut it out," Pip projected. The thought was sharp, laced with a terrifying desperation. "Take the metal out." "I can't," Arthur said flatly, pulling back. He didn't sugarcoat it. "The root systems are spliced directly into your cervical spine. If I try to rip that titanium casing out with a hydro spanner, you'll be paralyzed from the neck down or dead. I'm a mechanic, kid, not a neurosurgeon." "Then we are caught." "No," Arthur said, his jaw tightening. He turned to the heavy tool chest he had salvaged from the cargo hold. He started pulling out spools of micro wiring, a portable data slate, and a high-heat soldering iron. "A mechanic knows you don't always have to rebuild the engine. Sometimes you just need to bypass the faulty sensor." He worked fast. He stripped a length of heavy shielded cabling, exposing the fine gold filaments inside. He spliced the wire directly into the data slate, creating a crude physical bridge. "The port is a storage drive and a transmitter," Arthur explained, mostly talking to keep his own panic at bay. "I can't pull the drive out of your spine, but I can dump the data onto this slate and then burn out the transmitter's internal antenna with a localized power surge. You'll still have the port in your neck, but it'll be a dead piece of metal. No signal. No data." Pip watched him, her golden eyes wide. "Will it hurt?" Arthur paused. He held the soldering iron in his hand, the tip glowing a dull, angry orange. He looked at the tiny, abused creature, trusting him with her life. "Yeah," Arthur said softly. "It's gonna hurt like hell, but only for a second." He picked up the physical connector at the end of the wire. "I need to plug this into you to initiate the data dump. Ready?" Pip closed her eyes. "Ready." Arthur lined up the connector with the heavily scarred input slot on the back of her neck. He pushed it in. It clicked into place with a sickeningly mechanical sound. Instantly, Arthur gasped, dropping the soldering iron. It wasn't a physical shock. It was a psychic backwash. The sheer volume of data locked inside Pip's brain suddenly bypassed her localized dampeners and bled directly into Arthur's mind through their empathic link. He fell against the bulkhead, clutching his head. Blueprints, miles of them. Schematics for a biological weapon. A genetic virus designed to target specific agricultural crops on the outer colony worlds. Mass starvation as a corporate strategy to drive up the price of synthetic nutrient pastes. Millions of lives weighed against quarterly profit margins. The sheer cold malice of the data was suffocating. It tasted like ash and copper in Arthur's mouth. This wasn't corporate espionage. This was genocide. Mercer wasn't just a thug. He was an eraser sent to tie up loose ends. God, Arthur choked out, forcing his eyes open. On the workbench, Pip was rigid, her mouth open in a silent scream. The data transfer was tearing through her fragile nervous system. The screen on the data slate was scrolling furiously, green text blurring past as terabytes of classified horror poured out of her. Arthur fought through the blinding headache. He lunged forward, grabbing the heavy battery pack from his plasma torch. He ripped the insulated casing off, exposing the raw, sparking leads. The data slate chimed. Transfer complete. "Hold on, Pip," Arthur roared. He jammed the raw, live electrical leads directly against the transmitter housing on her neck port. A sharp blue spark snapped in the cramped air. The smell of burning ozone and singed hair filled the engineering bay. The titanium housing popped, a thin wisp of acrid gray smoke curling up from the metal. Pip went completely limp, collapsing onto the microfiber cloth. Arthur pulled the leads away, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He dropped the battery pack. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic throb of the warp core. He reached out, his massive shaking hand resting gently over her ribs. A heartbeat, faint, erratic, but there. The microscanner on the bench lay silent, no ping, no signal. The beacon was dead. Arthur slumped against the workbench, sliding down until he was sitting on the grated floor. He wiped a hand across his sweating face. He looked at the data slate containing the ruin of a dozen colony worlds. Then he looked up at the tiny unconscious creature, breathing softly on his bench. He was just a mechanic. He fixed broken things. But as he sat in the belly of the stolen ship, speeding through the dark, Arthur Finch realized that for the first time in his life, he was going to have to break something. He was going to break Mercer and every corporate suit who thought they could play God. The Iron Hound tore its way out of slipspace with a violent, shuddering groan that reverberated through every bulkhead. The blinding blue vortex outside the reinforced viewport snapped out of existence, instantly replaced by the vast, absolute black of the outer rim, peppered with the hard, cold diamond light of distant stars. Arthur cut the primary thrusters. The ship's heavy vibrations dialed down into a low, metallic rattle. He sat perfectly still in the pilot's seat, letting the silence of deep space wash over him. His ribs ached with a dull, rhythmic throb, and his right knee felt like it was packed with crushed glass. He tasted stale coffee and old blood. He unbuckled his harness and pushed himself up, leaning heavily on the navigation console. He grabbed the data slate from the dash, its screen dark now, the terabytes of classified genocide safely locked behind a heavy encryption protocol he had slapped together. He limped back to the engineering bay. the air was still thick with the smell of scorched ozone and burnt hair. Pip lay on the microfiber cloth, exactly where he had left her. She hadn't moved. Arthur's chest tightened. He set the data slate on a rusted crate and stepped closer to the workbench. He reached out, his grease-stained hand hovering over her thin, skeletal frame. Before he could touch her, a tufted ear flicked. Pip opened her eyes. The blinding bioluminescent gold that had characterized her panic was gone. Her eyes were still large and reflective, but the color had settled into a deep, warm amber. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the dim, flickering overhead light. Quiet! The word didn't scrape against Arthur's frontal lobe. It didn't carry the static of terror or the crushing weight of physical agony. It settled into his mind like a falling leaf touching the surface of a still pond. It was incredibly, profoundly quiet. Yeah, Arthur breathed, pulling the heavy magnifying goggles off his forehead and tossing them onto the bench. The transmitter is slag. You're off the grid, kid. Nobody's listening. Pip slowly gathered her legs beneath her, moving with stiff, uncoordinated caution. She turned her head, testing the mobility of her neck. The titanium port was still there, an ugly, jagged lump of metal protruding from her skin, but the synthetic gel had held. It was scarred, imperfect, and permanent. But it was dead. She looked at Arthur. A new sensation rippled across the empathic link. It wasn't an image or a word. It was a physical feeling. The phantom sensation of a deep, vibrating warmth settling directly into Arthur's chest, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the ship's failing life support. She was purring. It started as a low, mechanical rattle in her throat, vibrating through her ribs and echoing in Arthur's mind as pure, unadulterated relief. She stepped forward on wobbly legs and pressed her head firmly against the side of Arthur's rough, calloused hand. Arthur closed his eyes for a second, swallowing hard against the sudden, sharp lump in his throat. He gently stroked the soft fur behind her ears. "You're welcome, Pip." He picked up the data slate and slipped it into the deep pocket of his canvas jacket. "Come on, let's see what the previous tenant left in the pantry. You need fuel, real fuel, not that synthetic sludge." Arthur walked back toward the galley, not bothering to hide his heavy limp. Pip followed, her claws clicking softly against the grated deck plating. She stayed close to his boot, her tail wrapping briefly around his ankle every time he paused to catch his breath. The Ironhound's galley was a disaster. Empty nutrient tins were piled in the sink, and the chemical refrigerator hummed with a failing compressor. Arthur ripped the door open. Most of it was garbage. But tucked in the back, behind a row of empty synthetic bourbon bottles, he found a vacuum-sealed pack of cured salted meat. Real meat, smuggler's luxury. He tore the plastic open with his teeth. The sharp, smoky smell filled the small space. Pip sat back on her haunches, her amber eyes wide, her nose twitching rapidly. Food, she projected, a sudden spike of pure, predatory focus cutting through the quiet. Yeah, real food. Arthur cut a generous strip with his pocket knife and tossed it onto a relatively clean plate on the floor. Pip did